They get stuck because they can't grow their behaviours to meet the new requirements. So they often become a bottleneck, a choke point for what happens because every decision kind of goes through that person. And there are a couple of issues with that. The first is that there's a real lack of diversity in thinking. That person's brain is the limiting factor for the whole environment because everybody needs their approval. That also tends to mean that people are not comfortable at putting forward their own ideas because they tend to not be given a lot of airtime, and those owners can just go with their own thoughts. Because it's quicker, especially if they're time pressured, they'll be more directive than a coach-like interaction. So they really just are never out of the business, and that can kind of exaggerate this cycle as well, I think.
Hey, welcome back to the Scale My Clinic podcast. Today, I've got Todd with me, and we're going to be discussing golden handcuffs, but not in the type that you think and not in a kinky way either.
I think they're the pink fluffy handcuffs, such a completely different category.
Yeah, depends if you're Diddy or not, maybe. I hope he doesn't come after me. Now, golden handcuffs. I want us to talk about today how success might secretly trap a practice owner. And so what I mean by that is maybe someone's done really well, they've got to a certain stage, maybe they hit a plateau or they just feel stuck and they know they've done so well to get to this stage that they're at. They just can't break through to the next level, or things don't seem to be happening or coming as easily as they used to. So I want to talk about that, Todd. Maybe start us off by where you see this type of situation arise.
Yeah. So I think, interestingly, success can be a poor teacher. We very rarely interrogate our successes as we do failures. And so sometimes what happens is we can tend to attribute success to our genius or our special knowledge or whatever it might be, when in fact, a good portion of that may well be luck. And one of your jobs in business is to increase the surface area for luck, because that's an important principle as well. More luck happens to people that are better prepared. There is little doubt about that. But you can sometimes have a false attribution when you are successful. And so therefore you think, if I just keep doing those same things, then I'll continue to succeed. But of course, the world moves on and the environment changes and shifts. And so you do need to adjust. And we walk through that three futures framework that we've worked with Simon Bowen on. And so I'm imagining that where you've got the line on the graph that's just the time now, and then we go ahead in time 3 years. And there are, broadly speaking, three outcomes. One of them is the red line that goes down, that drifts. And that is actually often the golden handcuffs, where people the things that worked before are no longer working, and they're not really reflecting on those changes. They're kind of just muddling through and hoping that things go back to the glory days. You'll see that in sporting athletes and things where their time is done and they're kind of sticking around a little bit longer than they should. And then there's a line in the middle, which we usually color orange, that kind of bounces around and stays on that baseline. And these people are putting in a little bit of effort, making some changes, but they're usually reactive changes. They're things that are brought to them often by other people or their observations of what others are doing. It's not really deep-seated sort of strategic insight that's driving that change. That can be really tiring, because they're those practices where people get, a lot of change happens in those practices, but it's generally not the right thing that people should be doing. And so at the end of the 3 years, they're pretty well in the same position as they were at the start, except they're tired. They're older and obviously 3 years older and knackered because the changes didn't really amount to anything. And then that third group are where they're on the green line, and that exponentially moves upwards over the 3 years. Closer towards the end of the 3 years is where it starts to accelerate. Those people are making the right choices, and they're capable of reflecting that, as Marshall Goldsmith would say, what got me here won't get me there. The fact that you've succeeded to date doesn't mean that the universe owes you anything, and it doesn't mean that your prior experiences, knowledge, and beliefs are going to drive things further. It may be that some of those require a reboot, and you should ideally be rebooting before you're required to. And I think if there was a business that best illustrates this point, it's probably Kodak, who invented the digital camera and then decided that despite inventing it, they'll do their best to suppress and really not make it a big thing, because it wasn't going to be a major threat to them. And so that's probably an example of how golden handcuffs may play out with a really public example.
And so one of the things we've often seen in this situation is someone may have sacrificed, worked really hard to get to a certain point, and they're like the glue. The practice revolves around that owner. But now they're at a size where, what happens at that point? Like, they get stuck. Why do they get stuck?
Yeah, they get stuck because they can't grow their behaviors to meet the new requirements. So they often become a bottleneck, a choke point for what happens, because every decision kind of goes through that person. And there are a couple of issues with that. The first is that there's a real lack of diversity in thinking. That person's brain is the limiting factor for the whole environment, because everybody needs their approval. That also tends to mean that people are not comfortable at putting forward their own ideas because they tend to not be given a lot of airtime, and those owners can just go with their own thoughts. Because it's quicker, especially if they're time pressured, they'll be more directive than a coach-like interaction. And then the other part is the key person risk. You are having a really high degree of key person redundancy risk, where something was to happen with the person from a health perspective, or even if they just wanted to take a holiday, they can't do that. And when you talk to these owners and you say, when was your last holiday? They say, oh, well, I wasn't really a holiday. I was able to get 2 extra days off over a long weekend. And even then, they probably spoke to their practice manager and had emails and things going between them. And so they really just are never out of the business. And that can kind of exaggerate this cycle as well, I think.
Cool. Or not cool. It doesn't feel nice when you're in that situation. And I think you and I would have both been there in the early stages when you sort of have to do what you have to do to get things moving. What do you find are the key sort of ways to break out of that? So how do you unshackle those golden cuffs?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question, because the first thing is, it isn't easy. Because what happens is, when you kind of let go of things and you start to hand things off, typically they don't go as well as when you were looking after it all yourself. That's usually your fault, which I'll explain a little bit in a moment. However, what that can do is tend to promote this vicious cycle where you give something away for a little bit, you're not happy with how it goes, and so you take it back as well. The reason, or at least one of the reasons that happens poorly, is that you don't fully unpack what you're doing, that you're handing off. And so what you actually do is a really crappy delegation, a really crappy handoff, and that person is just being set up to fail. And then you're not allowing them to fail and go through some learning cycles. I think whenever you're in a business where you're changing the way you think and behave, it's useful to think about it like coaching a kids team in sport or something, that you just have to let things go slowly at the start and allow people to experiment and fail a little bit, and not step in and try and save them when they're actually learning, because you've deprived them of that opportunity for a long time as that leader that holds everything themselves. And you should just be honest with the fact that you've actually stunted their development by not allowing them those failures. And we've got a really good friend who's a very successful business person who's a lead at this. And I remember talking to him particularly about an event that he ran. The team had made a decision to run it in a place that wasn't amenable to where the vast majority of their clients were. And he knew it was a bad idea. And it was going to cost tens of thousands of dollars more than it should have, because it was in this new environment. But he was evolved enough to know that the team needed to learn this lesson themselves, and that him telling the team all of the things that were in his head, yes, it might have reduced the risk of this particular event happening in this way, but it would have denied them growth. And also they would have come and spoken to him about every future event, and that hadn't happened for a while. So he'd actually managed to extricate himself from it. And I think I looked at the way he interacted in that particular environment and thought, wow, I don't know if I could personally do that. It was my honest reflection. But also I was really impressed by what was really effective leadership, by intentionally letting somebody take some decisions that he knew had a price. The price was not fatal to the business or the person, but it was an important lesson. And in the size of the business, it was a relatively small overhead, but a really enlightened approach. And I think the main lesson for me was, if you don't let people follow through all the way with their plans, and Marshall Goldsmith calls this adding excess value, kind of trying to tweak the last 5 or 10% of things. I'm very much guilty of this, by the way. That's the issue that he was trying to work on.
Cool. So letting things fail so people learn is one important skill to develop and behavior to develop. Do you think I've often wondered about this, vast majority of general practice owners are GPs, and so we're clinicians, and in a clinical setting, if things are a bit off, there's some risk management at play, and also you can't really, in a consultation, delegate to someone in the consultation. Like you might collaborate with a nurse or a non-GP specialist or another GP, but ultimately if something goes wrong in a treatment episode that we're leading as a GP, we feel, I think many of us would want control over that. Do you think part of it is that we're trained in control and then suddenly we're in a business setting where maybe it's not as necessary in the same way?
I think that's absolutely a problem, Sachin, all the way through, actually, from the time that you get into medicine. You're usually somebody who's over accountable, and that's part of the personality for people that get the marks in high school. Medicine only supercharges that. You're not really encouraged to be particularly collaborative. You are competing against the people that are in there, and then making errors is frowned upon. You could find yourself in front of APRA, depending on the consequences of the error. And so, again, we have further influences on weakening collaboration and isolating you to be accountable for your own decision making. And so what happens is people often take that clinician brain into leadership. And it's actually, I'm not sure that it's completely the opposite of what's required, but it's not that far off completely opposite. The hyper accountability, the hyper personal accountability is not that useful because it tends to mean that you build behaviors that are not scalable, that are all highly dependent on your individual thinking and your individual actions. And we know the way that people think is modified by a lot of things, but HALT is the traditional thing we talk about: hungry, angry, late, tired, frustrated, undercaffeinated, all of the things that lead you to perform at levels below your best. The same things will happen in your business. And if you're making decisions when you're not at your best, then that little circle that is your best behaviors, your best thinking, just shrinks dramatically. And ultimately, it still is whatever the size of that circle is that limits everything in your business. It's much, much better to have diversity of thinking, a psychologically safe space where people can think and challenge ideas, where there's a high degree of trust that people kind of have your back in your absence or when there's something that requires help with. And then they can move towards actually one of my favorite sayings, which is Lencioni saying, and it's a mining for conflict, so that you actually intentionally seek conflict, but it's more about healthy disagreement and that kind of steel hardened steel concept of if you have good ideas competing, that what we'll end up with is hearing all of the different inputs that are relevant, and then the decision is still made by the leader. It's not necessarily collaborative in that everyone agrees to it, but it's collaborative in that everyone's consulted. So maybe it's consultative, might be better. And then the person who's accountable for following it through may well have the final call on what that decision is, so that they have full ownership of that and then follow through.
So that's really useful. Typically in these sort of settings, an owner would be like, okay, I'm ready to relinquish some control and let others step up. But no one's stepping up. My team's not stepping up. How do I get my team to step up?
Yeah, I reckon this is something that I think is Keith Cunningham has a good framework for this in a great book called The Road Less Stupid. And I think it's the apology. You need to lead with vulnerability and apologize for the way you've led in the past, and that you may have stifled individual creativity and individual contribution in an attempt to try and move quickly or to reduce errors, that the trade-off is that you may not have engaged the wisdom, experience and diversity of thinking of others in your team. And so the way he does it, I really like, and I've had to do this a few times in multiple businesses, make an apology for the way I've led. And then as part of the apology, you seek permission to lead the team from this point forwards. And they have to say, yeah, we agree and we appreciate you acknowledging this. And then it would be really important to actually say, okay, how do you think we move forward on this? What would be, and actually get some feedback from those that you lead as to how they would like to see it change, and talk through the different ways that it could change, and give them permission to call out any old behaviors. You're not likely to say, I want to change, and then just change. Like, that's not the process of change. So just say, if you notice me doing things that are not helpful or are harmful and they're like this, please call it out, because I'm trying to get better. And so as part of improvement, I'm going to need your help if you recognize these behaviors, these habits coming through again, and talking that through. That's probably the most useful. And then I think the other thing, Sachin, at the end of a meeting like that, or a meeting with your team, people often say, do you have any feedback? Which is actually not helpful. Most people have no feedback. But what you can ask instead is, do you have any advice for me? And do you have any advice for me that I can invest in future? So that's sometimes called feed forward. It's a different approach than feedback, because ultimately you're seeking advice as to how you could do this better next time. And most people are okay with that because it doesn't feel personal. You're like, oh, yeah, cool. Okay, well, next time you could lead with this, or you might do this instead. Make sure you write those things down and then connect back to them at the next meeting. So last time we had this meeting, I received some advice that I should do this and this instead. So I'm working on that today. If that doesn't happen, or if you notice me going back to old ways, please make sure that you point it out.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's really important. The other thing that I think that can happen in these settings from the people we've spoken to over the times is that people around you can get comfortable, or you may have surrounded yourself by people who sort of don't have the ability to challenge, or despite us asking for it, may not want to challenge, or not, maybe coasting, not interested in getting involved. And so it wouldn't be unusual to need some hard conversations, and needing to have some hard conversation or courageous conversations in this setting. Can you talk to that a bit?
Yeah, like you said, you may have recruited yes people because at the time that was your preference, or you may have turned good people into yes people yourself. So you may be accountable for their resistance to change. I think at all times, the business requires renewal. That's personal. That's you as a leader needing to renew your beliefs, your actions, your behaviors, your thinking, and your skills. Those things require regular updates, your knowledge, and so do your team. And so some people will want to do that, some won't. And so it's reasonable to have conversations with people if they're not able to move forward around, this is a coaching framework, we're going to work towards this. If you don't want to come along for the ride, that's okay too. You certainly don't want to make assumptions that people are ready to grow or change the way that they do things. Not everybody loves that. And there might be other factors in their life where that's not possible for them at the moment. They lack the capacity to make those changes. But one of the things that you and I have observed a lot in our own business, but those that we coach, is you can't grow into pain. And so if things are painful now, and in your mind, be it conscious or subconscious, is, if I had double the business, I would have double the pain that's there now. What will happen is you'll resist growing the business because you don't want double that pain. So you do need to be thinking about, how do I need to change my own beliefs, my own skills, knowledge, behaviors in order to grow this business with less reliance on me and getting more of the right people in. We often hear them called A graders. Again, I'm throwing a few books around today, but that is a definition that's really well articulated in a book called Who, Solving Your Number One Problem. I think if you Google Who the book, you'll find it. We'll make sure we put that in the session notes. But that gives a really elegant description of an A grader. And they describe an A grader as somebody who can do that which only 10% of people can do, but they can do it 90% of the time. And so they are highly consistent at doing things in the top decile. That's by definition a small group of people. It's certainly less than 10% of people, because they have to be in the top 10%, reliably in the top 10%. And so if you're going to be upgrading your business, you want to be top grading your team. And that means that from time to time reviewing not just the people, but also the structure and the environment, making sure all of those things are evolving in the way that you would like, just intentional evolution.
Cool. So someone is listening to this who at this point has decided, right, I'm going to make a change. It's time. In the words of Michael Jackson, it's the man in the mirror moment. What is the 1, 2, or 3 next things that they should do to go about making this change?
So I think the first thing is, once you've decided to change, you need to then ask yourself, what does that look like? As in, what will the new version of you be like? And I think you don't have to be specific on that. You just have to kind of be directionally accurate. And I would probably sense check that with somebody who has traversed the next bit of business that you've traversed, because the number one thing when you decide to make a change is you don't kind of enthusiastically run in the wrong direction. Make sure that that's right. So I would cross-check that. Again, there's a variety of ways you could do that. If you happen to know people that have been in a business the same as yours or like yours, you can talk to those people. If not, you want to be in a community where those people are. As we've said before, we work with practice owners in Project X. And so we do have that group of people that are handpicked. We have a no dickheads policy there. And so not everybody gets in, but being around the right people, that's very much a Jim Rohn thing. You're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. You might need to upgrade them. And then it probably is just about understanding exactly what you need to be doing differently and moving towards just more reliably doing that. I think we often make this really kind of unreasonable expectation that just because you've decided something, you do it. But actually, you're testing out a new thinking, you're testing out new behaviors, and you're trying to calibrate the feedback, because as you do new things, you'll get different feedback. And it can be really a bit confusing because it's not the same as what you were getting before. So there's a period of time of kind of calibration to the new behaviors, of making sure that you're reinforcing and doing the right things. And then the real metric is the business growing? That's the real metric, because if you're trying to change these things and the business isn't growing, well, then you probably need to ask some deeper questions. A lot of this just involves expertise that you might not have. And it does mean having people around you that know about these things, are aware of these things, are working on them themselves or have addressed them in themselves, and who are aware of what it looks like on the other side. So that's sounding more and more like coaching and being around the right people. And again, unsurprisingly, that's the work that not only do you and I do that, we receive coaching, and a lot of the coaching we receive is specific to, okay, these are the things we need to be working on. And we're really privileged in being able to get in guest speakers that can actually talk to our audience about these things as well, because you don't traditionally see them talked about in the stuff that you see in the marketplace for owners. Tends to be more tactical, not transformational, shifting beliefs and moving behaviors in the right way. But it's a really different identity to that of a general practitioner. And so I think part of it is recognizing you need to build new identities, and those new identities have different behaviors, beliefs, and interactions in the universe. And you need to make sure you're wearing the right hat at the right time. There is a lot of nuance to that, I think, underneath that. But that's probably what I think. What do you think?
Yeah, I think once you've got awareness of the situation, I think there's a good conversation to be had in the business. And that starts with, in my opinion, once you've decided, then I think it is just a line in the sand that this isn't going to happen from this moment forward. And then I think you need to judge the reactions of those around you, because you sort of need to know who's on board for this and get the feedback of those around you. I think someone may have just for the very first time listening today have thought, oh, this is something I need to tackle. And so the reality is it's not an overnight thing. And the likelihood is that the pattern of behavior that's been is probably very closely linked to a set of results. And so I suspect there are some different results that the person wants. And I think that really the decision is that I want those different results. And I understand now that on the journey to get those different results, I'm going to have to become a different human. And so I'm going to embark on the process of getting the different results. And I'm aware that along that journey, I'm going to be changing as a human. As I change as a human, my business will also change. My business will have to change the way it operates, the things it does, and how it goes about that. Hopefully, the right people are there and will come along on the journey with me. Also, I need to be aware that as part of achieving something new and better and bigger, that's not always comfortable. It will require some discomfort for me as a leader and for those around me. And that's okay, because most of the time, nothing worth achieving was achieved without putting effort in. And so I think it starts with just a recognition of I'm going to make a change, and then a movement to a commitment towards that change. And normally that's some type of help. It might be read a book, but again, that's knowledge. Change happens with action. And so it's fine to have some knowledge, but it needs to be allied with actual action, because that's when results happen. And so, yeah, that's the way I'd be thinking about it.
Yeah, I think the one question for people to be left with here potentially is, where are you holding the wheel out of habit rather than necessity? Where is it that you are continuing to hold the reins, but really that's not required. And if you think, yep, actually there are places where that's the case, then this piece of work needs to be done.
That is a perfect place to stop. So before you go back to do whatever you were doing, what you've got to do next, just spend 60 seconds, 90 seconds answering that question. Where are you holding the wheel out of habit, not out of necessity? A great question to finish with. I've been Sachin. He's been Todd. We've been the Scale My Clinic podcast. We'll see you next time.